Hi, welcome everybody. I'm going to do this video lecture. Unfortunately, class just didn't work out. I forgot that I had had a prior commitment every holiday season around Christmas time. I volunteer actually to deliver food to people. We do it something through our work, and I normally school doesn't interfere with that, but because we were late getting kind of set up this year and continuing, I still had class, and I had forgot all about that commitment that I had made earlier in the year. So I thought I will just put this little video up talking about harm reduction, and I'm sure everybody could use the excess time. So I hope everybody got my email and was able to not show up for class. Harm reduction, there's a couple of key things that I wanted to talk about because they are going to be part of the test on January 4th. So getting started with that, a couple things. One, harm reduction. So you see there's harm reduction refers to policies, programs, practices that aim primarily to reduce adverse health, social, and economic consequences of use of legal and illegal psychoactive drugs without necessarily reducing drug consumption. Harm reduction benefits people who use drugs, their families, and the community. So some of the key things in this statement is that harm reduction is not just about reducing the adverse health effects of individuals. It's also looking at reducing the adverse social effects and economic consequences from drugs and alcohol and other addictive behaviors. So I think that first part is really key. The second piece that we see that is key here is the fact that harm reduction is not necessarily about reducing consumption. So it isn't necessarily. Now, that means, it's not necessarily, the goal of harm reduction isn't necessarily abstinence. And abstinence and abstaining, we talked about that last week. That's the idea of not using. And so with harm reduction, we do look at the fact that we are not necessarily encouraging reduced use. Now, a lot of harm reduction strategies will in fact reduce the use, and abstinence is actually a harm reduction strategy. It's not in contrast to harm reduction. Abstinence is actually a part of harm reduction, but it's not the only form of harm reduction. So the real goal is to reduce the adverse health, social, and economic consequences. The last thing there too is that harm reduction benefits people who use drugs, their families, and the community. So it really isn't just for the people who struggle with substance use, it's also for the community. There's health-related harms that we look at, especially around reduced suspension. Sorry, I feel like I've got congested sinuses today. And some of them are the reduction of HIV and hepatitis C, overdoses, abscesses or infections, bloodstream infections, death, or other physical harm. These are often harms associated with legal drug use, and so this is partly why we have harm reduction strategies. The goal isn't necessarily to reduce the use, but is to reduce the harm. So there's also societal harms. We see crime, physical violence, and increased cost to the healthcare system. This slide, what it does is it is actually displaying how much it costs currently in Ontario, Prairies, British Columbia, for medical beds or hospital stays. So what you see here is that first one, Ontario, you see the daily ward bed. That's $17 to $3,300 a day. An intensive care bed is anywhere from $3,000 to almost $6,000. And these numbers are taken from 2012, so I mean those numbers could be inflated today. And what we see, in Ontario, that's a lot of money. So you figure if we go back to, somebody contracts or overdoses and ends up in the hospital and maybe is in ICU or intensive care for 2 days while they're being stabilized, and then in the hospital for another 2 days after that overdose, that hospital stay could cost anywhere between $10,000 to $15,000. And so, that is a serious cost that our system has to incur. So when we look at harm reduction, we also look at the cost, right? That's that economic benefit that we look at. I would say, coming back to the economic piece, it's a large piece of harm reduction. Not necessarily in my job. My job, I really am concerned about reducing the harm on individuals and societal and family harms. But, I mean, it is important to know that when people who are making the laws and politicians, they often look at different financial benefits. It's like speaking different people's language. When I work with a client, they might not be concerned about how much it costs the hospital stays because they're not paying it, but they might be concerned about the physical harm. So we just speak whatever language to the people who we're talking to around that. Why harm reduction? Well, abstinence is actually not desired or achievable by everyone. Not everybody chooses abstinence, and it's not desired by everybody. And for some people, it's easy. I have a lot of people in my office who have quit and would say it's easy for somebody else to quit. That's not necessarily the case. It isn't always easy for somebody to quit. And for some people, maybe it's not achievable. It's not really for us to say, and it definitely isn't desirable by everybody. Also, we know that enforcement is limited in its ability to contain the supply of many substances. Jail, for instance, there's many substances in jail. And we don't have harm reduction strategies for that because we say, well, you shouldn't have drugs in jail. But there are, and we know that that is heavily enforced. I mean, people are searched when they come in. We know how heavily enforced jails are, and they still have drugs. So we know that enforcement is limited in its ability to stop the supply. People will continue to use drugs, even get sick or die. So if we don't give out harm reduction and we don't talk harm reduction strategies, that's not going to stop people from using. We're going to talk about it later in today in a couple minutes, but harm reduction doesn't actually, there's no research that shows that harm reduction strategies actually increase use. We can reduce the number of deaths and the amount of harm that people experience, which again, if we reduce those things, can likely reduce the cost that drug addiction costs to our society. The types of harm. So we see harm reduction practices are entrenched in our society in many ways. I mean, we have all kinds that we don't even think of harm reduction. A seatbelt. A seatbelt won't necessarily save your life. It could, but people still die wearing seatbelts once in a while. What we do know, though, is that they do significantly reduce the harm, and in many cases, they actually do stop death and physical harm and injury. Helmets for cycling, skateboarding, skiing, snowboarding, same idea. It doesn't necessarily stop it. But I mean, in some cases, it actually may prevent physical damage or physical harm. But in a lot of cases, it's more of a harm reduction, right? We're still going to do those things. We see condoms with the use of STIs and pregnancies, and what we also see is, so practicing safe sex is a great strategy, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is 100% going to stop STIs. And so what we know is that it's a harm reduction strategy. This is always a great example around harm reduction strategies not increasing the amount of users. So when I was in high school, they didn't really have a whole lot of condom machines in schools and things like that. My school had one condom machine. This is in like 1995. And it was in like a far corner of a bathroom, which just nobody ever talked about. They definitely weren't given out at like the school, the guidance counselor's offices or things like that. Definitely wasn't talked about in health class. So what happens is that, I mean, the theory then should be that people aren't having sex, right? So if we give condoms, we're going to encourage people to have sex. I mean, we all know that that's likely not true, and that whether teenagers or people in general are, whether they have condoms or not, that isn't necessarily. There may be some people who didn't engage in certain sexual activities because it wasn't protected sex, but we also know lots of people who will just forego it and say, well, it would be ideal, but I don't have it. So access to condoms doesn't actually increase or decrease sex. People are going to have sex whether they have condoms or not. Now, if they have access to condoms, they're likely, what we know is that research shows that a percentage of population will use them, therefore reducing STIs. And so that's just how we show that like one doesn't actually translate to the other. And we also see like hand washing. These are all ways we use harm reduction in our everyday lives. We also see harm reduction for legal drug use, like lowers drinking guidelines, campaigns to reduce drinking and driving, NRTs or nicotine replacement therapies. So these are all legal ways in which we might use those. And I'll post this presentation, and there's links in the presentation. Harm reduction is effective for reducing harms of illegal drugs as well. So we see needle exchange programs that prevent HIV and hepatitis C. I don't know if people are aware of this. Hepatitis C treatment is roughly about $70,000 to get it, and I highly encourage any of my stable clients to go through a treatment. It's horrific and it's really difficult on their body, but that costs about $70,000 to our taxpayers. If somebody doesn't go through the treatment and their hepatitis C affects them, typically it's about $200,000 to $250,000 over their lifetime that they will cost the medical system. HIV, I believe, is somewhere in the neighborhood of $250,000 to $500,000 what it would cost the healthcare system, versus the about $100,000 for treatment. So, you know, when we look at it, not that there's treatment for HIV, but there's prevention, and there is some medication that you can take that helps reduce the spread, but also reduces the HIV spreading to AIDS. And so what we see is that there's also supervised consumption sites. So this is supervised injection sites where people can actually go and inject substances. They're not given substances. All they're doing is given a safe, clean space and clean supplies. And for every $1, or I mean, really, it probably costs about 15 cents to give out a hypodermic needle. You know, if that stops somebody from contracting hepatitis C, that saves anywhere from $70,000 to $150,000. And so when we think about it in that way, it makes a lot of sense to give people clean needles. Methadone maintenance program, again, this is a program that people can use. They can supplement. It's essentially a opioid. So it's not heroin, but like a legal form of opioid for people who struggle with opioid addiction, heroin, Oxycontin, all those kinds of things. And they can take the methadone on a regular basis. Where it was first introduced, and the whole point is that people were contracting HIV and AIDS and hepatitis C, and they were just contracting diseases and getting sick and overdosing and dying at such a rapid rate. Crime was rampant, especially Lower East Side in Vancouver. If you watched Through a Blue Lens, you would remember that. And so what happened is, if you could get people on methadone, it would significantly reduce the impact to people themselves, but also societal and economical. And so it kind of fits that perfect definition. And so we have methadone maintenance programs, we have crack pipe distribution and disposal programs for pipes and needles. These are all harm reduction strategies. Harm reduction is often only thought on focusing on those who are unable or unwilling to stop using. That is not true. There's lots of room for movement with that. You know, I connect to people and I use harm reduction strategy in my office all the time, and we start with harm reduction, and then a couple months later they might decide that they actually want to quit. And so, does harm reduction promote drug use? We don't see it. There isn't research to support that. Harm reduction is compatible with abstinence. It's not against it, but again, it's just one of the many strategies. Research shows that harm reduction activities do not encourage substance use. They actually discourage people to use. People do not want to be addicted to substances. It's not something most people want, and most people want help and support from getting away from them. We have needle exchange programs, and so what we have here is these are programs that will give clean needles, supplies, recovery, education. Again, I'm going to post a video. They talk great about Insight, which is a safe injection site in BC. It was the only one up until the Liberal government just recently passed over the last 6 months, and has given funding to a couple, 3 more in Ontario, and maybe 4 more in the country. Needle exchange programs, again, different types of needle exchange. There's fixed sites, mobile sites, secondary sites. You can see kind of the definitions there as you go through. This is just needle exchange. Again, I'm going to post this so you can feel free to go through that. Here's some other steps to prevent good practice within needle exchange programs. Here's some images of makeshift like pipes and things that people use. So you can see that people cut themselves, they can spread diseases. Hepatitis C is actually easily spread through the mouth if there's cuts. And here's some of the other harms. This is like a safe smoking kit or a safe injection kit. Goals of harm reduction, and I'm burning through this because I only have 60 seconds left on this video. They save lives, safer substance use, reduce substance use, abstinence, improved emotional state, improved health and relationships, a healthcare system, better nutrition, and more stable income. We also see that it builds relationships, reduces reduction in isolation, increases support, risk of HIV, and better living environment. There's a link to the video. I'm going to post this, so it'll be here. I'm also going to post that link. Please, everybody, watch the video, this video, but then also watch it's 20 minutes. It'll really help you on your final question, because there will be a final question likely on harm reduction. So I hope everybody has a safe and happy holidays, and a Merry Christmas to everybody. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email. The test review will be up on there. And so good luck to everybody. Thanks. Take care.